It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone.
Well, hello, and welcome to Islands at War. I'm Keith Bengelli, and I'm joined again, as always, with my co-presenter, Nick. Hi, Nick. How are you?
Hi, Keith. I'm good, thank you. And you?
I'm really good. And for this episode, you heard our new theme tune. It's called 5 to 7, and it's by a local artist, Jim Delbridge, from his album The Navigator. Halfway through the programme, which we're extending to 1 hour from this episode, we'll play the whole track about halfway through. From now on, this will be our intro and our outro. So I would urge you also to look on YouTube for the track, and it's called 5 to 7. That is 5, the digit, 2, T-O, 7. Fantastic video, and by the CD. So, Nick, we're in August 1940 now.
Yep.
July 1940 was the first full month of the occupation endured by our local population, the ones that remain behind. And it's a case of working through matters both social and civilian and military.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got plenty to talk about.
Absolutely, we have. And indeed, you've not only have you furnished me with some interesting information, we've also got some great things like adverts and inserts that we'll be putting up on our Facebook page, which is also called Islands at War. Indeed.
Yeah, no, I'll put some of the links to things that we mentioned throughout this podcast, and also some of the images that we're going to be talking about, adverts in the newspapers, a video about one of the people that we're going to talk about. There's plenty to see.
Yeah, so for anybody that is joining us for this, effectively our fourth episode, it's a podcast about the German occupation of the bailiwick of Guernsey. Now, Guernsey is not just Guernsey; it's Alderney, Sark, Herm, and a few other little places that might get a mention as we go. So that's the premise. We're going to record a program for every month right up to May 1945. It's an interesting project, but we're deep into it. We can't go back now, Nick.
Indeed. We will talk about Jersey as well at times,
if they merit it, of course. Yes. And it should be said that not only will we adhere to this month by month, but we are looking to record specials that will focus on items that are too big within the context of the occupation to be just referred to. I think that we've agreed on that, Nick. So what we're going to do, as we've done so far, is we look not just at the military aspects of the German occupation, but also as well, what interests me a lot is the social and civilian affairs. Now, Nick, the Germans now have been in the island for 1 whole month. Things that sort of we now take for granted as everyday or weekly events, such as church going, for example. Was there any curtailment of worship? How did the Germans go about allowing or controlling worship in the churches? All the churches remained open, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there were some problems that there weren't enough people to actually lead those church services, particularly the Methodist circuit, which was divided into two. I only discovered this the other day. The Methodist circuit was divided into two in Guernsey, and it eventually got amalgamated, I believe, into one, because they had to share out enough people to be leading those church services. And their problem was that a lot of people had been evacuated, and that meant they didn't have those people available. So you were getting one of the people that I've read about. He was sometimes doing 5 services in one day, but of course the only way he could get around was on his bicycle or on foot. And if you were living in the Vale, which he was, and you've got to get all the way out to the Imperial to go and give a church service, it was a bit of an epic journey for him.
Yeah, so just to clarify for overseas listeners, the Imperial is at the extremity of the island.
About as far away as you could get from where he was living, really. So But church services were allowed to continue. Praying for the royal family was still allowed, but there were some restrictions. And Douglas Ord received a missive along with all the other church leaders, which was a typed notification that was purportedly from the bailiff, but of course the bailiff was just repeating what he'd been told to inform those people, which said he was concerned that there might be a serious curtailment in freedom to religiously worship. He'd been informed that in speech and in prayer some persons had made reference to the forces of evil, and it is obvious that such words may bear an objectionable significance for the army of occupation. So he was basically just flagging to them that if they wanted things to carry on as they were, then they just need to be a bit careful about the words that they use.
Yeah, and it's probably worth here, Nick, just clarifying exactly who the bailiff. We will refer to the bailiff. Now, this is the head of our, effectively the head of our government, civilian government.
Yeah.
Would you agree on that? I mean, that's probably the best.
Yeah, at the time, yeah, absolutely. He was head of the government here. Interestingly, we'll get to it later on. He doesn't sort of run the controlling committee, but we'll touch on that later on.
We will, yeah. And the bailiff at this point is Carey?
Yes.
Who lived at the Vallon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was actually quite elderly.
Yes, that's right.
And he was also representing the Lieutenant Governor, because both the Lieutenant Governors from the Bailiwick of Guernsey and Jersey had been recalled.
And the Lieutenant Governor is the Queen or the Monarch's representative on the island.
Absolutely. So that, they were representing the King. So they'd been recalled, so they needed somebody else to take on that role. So both bailiffs were told to do that. They're also the head of the judicial system in the Channel Islands as well.
And you also touched on Douglas Ord. Douglas Ord was the head. He was a Methodist minister that elected to stay behind on Guernsey, and he wrote a marvellous set of diaries, the Ord diaries, which we are referring to very much in structuring this podcast.
Absolutely. We'll get to rumours and things like that later on. He's a very good temperature check on whether any of these rumours bore any resemblance to what was actually going on. So the other thing to talk about in terms of religious freedom to worship is it wasn't quite a level playing field. The Salvation Army had a particular problem. Now, the Germans didn't like anybody wearing uniforms. They only wanted uniforms that were their uniforms to be worn. So the Salvation Army were actually banned from wearing their uniforms.
So they were banned from wearing a uniform, not banned from worshipping.
They were effectively going to be banned completely.
Right. Okay.
The Germans wanted them disbanded, and their services were forbidden. So that particularly annoyed Major Marie Ozanne, who is a lady who has a blue plaque actually on her house where she lived. She'd been born in 1906 and became a major in the Salvation Army. She was particularly put out that they were going to be banned from worshipping, and they were not going to be allowed to use wear their uniforms. And she persistently wrote to the commandant about it, and the German commandant got so annoyed in the end because she was protesting about this and refusing to stop worshipping down at St Sampson's Salvation Army, and the commandant in the end got so annoyed with her, he personally ordered that her uniform be confiscated. Now, you might think at that point she'd think, well, no, I've had enough, this is far too risky. She carried on protesting, carried on writing to the commandant, carried on preaching as well. The final straw was, I mean, I've seen documentation, the Germans thought she was a lunatic, and I think she might have got away with it if she'd carried on just doing that, potentially, or maybe for longer. She saw the injustice of what was being done to the slave workers that were going past her house, and she was caught feeding them. And for that, she was taken to the prison unfortunately she fell very ill in 1942 and died in the hospital here.
Yeah, she was particularly upset at hearing the cries of resulting from torture that were coming from a house not too far from where she lived. You and I know, Nick, that whilst it's almost in the same locality, the houses are quite a remove, and to hear people in distress over that distance was pretty awful. So she had migrated from being concerned about her uniform to protesting against torture.
And the other thing, I mean, she did all of this without regard to her own personal safety.
Exactly.
To the extent that when the deportations started to happen, she twice volunteered to take someone's place, but was not allowed to go.
Yeah, so a very, very courageous lady, and in fact, Nick referred to a blue plaque. Now, this is a plaque that is not just unique to Guernsey. It's a universal way of commemorating a place or an abode of somebody that lived in, particularly lived there in times past. I think, Nick, is also you've got a link to put on our Facebook page.
Yes, I have.
That concerns
there's a great video by Dr. Gilly Carr. It's about 10 minutes long from memory, which tells the story of her, and it's really well worth a watch. It's fascinating.
Okay, so that will go up once the programme has gone out and Nick's updated the Facebook page. You'll have a chance to update yourself on a very brave woman, Major Marie Ozanne. Okay, so apart from the Salvation Army, everybody worshipping pretty much as they would. They've got some guidelines, etc. So moving away from worship and again within the sort of fabric of social and civilian affairs, we know that many, many men have gone to fight. We know that many, many men and women evacuated prior to the Germans arriving. We've got one of the statistics that I unearthed through Herbert Winterflood's diaries was the fact that there were 1,600 or so unemployed. And how was work found for so many people?
Well, the problem was 20,000-ish people had left, which left a big hole in the workforce, particularly as there were a lot of men of military age, so a lot of the younger men had gone, and women. So initially in July 1940, that caused a massive problem because there were people that didn't have a job because their boss had gone away or business closed down or it just couldn't continue for whatever reason. And then you had this massive problem of lots of jobs that needed to be done to keep the island running. So there was. I'm quite impressed by how quickly this happened.
Yes, absolutely.
There was just a massive exercise where these people were found jobs, and by the time, by sort of early August 1940, they're down to roughly 200 men, and I think it was 196 women that were looking for work but didn't have a job, which I think by early August 1940, having only been sort of 4 or 5 weeks into the occupation, that's pretty impressive that they managed to sort that out.
And this would have been done by the civil service, who themselves would have been impacted on that very reason. So about 1,600 unemployed, down to within a couple of weeks to about 400 men and women. That really is turning, on a very short circle there to get that done. We also have this. You touched on before. We have a sort of shrinkage, a deliberate shrinkage, a diminution of the government. Our Parliament would have had, it's got 40 MPs, so to speak, deputies as we know them then. It would have. How many would it have had prior to the war? Do you know?
I'm not sure actually what the stats were for how many were in the government. That's something I'd have to look at. Actually.
But it's about. I'd say it's probably between 20 and 30.
Yeah.
But then the Germans forced a shrinkage of the government, and
well, it wasn't necessarily forced by the Germans. What happened was back in June, late June 1940. In the case of Guernsey, it was 21st of June. The states of Guernsey decided that it looked like occupation was potentially going to happen, so they needed to come up with what they were going to do. if that was going to be the case. So they met for the first time. The controlling committee was formed, which met for the first time on the 25th of June, so before the Germans had arrived, and that was made up of the heads of the various different departments.
So what we're talking about, 5, 6 people?
It was a total of 8, I think, in total that were involved. That included Ambrose Sherwell as the Attorney General, who was basically the president of the controlling committee. So they were basically the heads of those departments. They were allowed to pick 2 people to assist them, and that's they formed things like the Essential Commodities Committee. Basically, just everything to make sure the island could keep running.
And a particular gentleman was sort of a liaison between the controlling committee and the German occupying forces. This, of course, was Louis Guillemette.
Yes, it was.
And we'll talk about Louis in great detail when we get into 1941, because his activities are fully underway. And again, he's another person that wrote some extraordinary diaries, and they come on stream early part of 1941.
And if you've listened to our June 1940 episode, you'll have heard us refer to him there, because
very much so.
He was the man who had the unenviable job of having the UK government on one end of the telephone and having to relay them what was the discussions that were going on in the states of Guernsey. That's effectively the same as our Houses of Parliament if you're listening from the UK. He was relaying with the discussions that were going on in that meeting to the other to Whitehall on the other end, and they were then relaying messages back via him. So I wouldn't have fancied being the middleman doing that.
No, and in fact, it is complete serendipity. But I was chatting to Josie, Louis' daughter, who's fantastically sharp of mind as she's clocking on. But she mentioned to me yesterday about her father often getting accused of collaboration because of the role that he was put in. But we'll get to that.
We'll talk about him later on.
Yes, we will in due course. So the president of the controlling committee is Sherwell, Sir Ambrose Sherwell, who went on to become Sir Ambrose Sherwell.
Correct.
But he had an incredible story within the framework of the occupation. He made a broadcast, Nick, which was possibly still regarded as controversial.
Yes, it is regarded as controversial. It depends if you look at it in context. So we mentioned,
which is important.
Yeah, indeed. So we mentioned the controlling committee just now. Now I was, as it happens, looking at the minutes of the controlling committee yesterday up at the Priaulx Library as I was researching something else, and I looked back and found that actually he was asked to make this speech as early as the 5th of July, so not even the end of the first week of the occupation. He'd been approached by the Germans to make this speech, and they discussed it in the controlling committee meeting.
So the speech was going to be, what was the medium to carry the speech?
It was going to be on the radio.
The German radio.
Yeah, and that was the idea. Now, it was discussed, it was pitched to them as being a way of getting a message to those that had been evacuated, that people, what was going on. He was only allowed, well, in the initial approach, it said he was allowed 100 words. I think it's slightly longer than that if you read the entire thing, and you could see why you'd want to do it. All these people, the 20,000 that have gone from Guernsey, and no doubt, people from Jersey would also be interested to know what's going on, because they would hope that probably the same things are happening in Jersey.
So Ambrose Sherwell was approached, but nobody in Jersey was approached to do the same thing?
I'm not aware of anybody
I've
in
never
Jersey
heard that
doing
either.
it.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Thing. It takes a few interesting twists. So that was the 5th of July he was approached, and they agreed that he should probably do that after a bit of discussion. Now this was broadcast on the 1st of August on Radio Bremen, and the request was made in that speech that the BBC would rebroadcast it.
But recorded on Guernsey.
It was recorded on Guernsey, and there's an interesting story to that, in that it was recorded here. Sherwell didn't know when it would be broadcast. He was hoping it would be broadcast sooner rather than later. But it basically it didn't really contain anything controversial as far as I can see, other than the fact that he made this speech.
Yes, exactly. It's not the content; it was the fact that he did it.
So I've got a copy of the speech in front of me, and it starts off, with talking about His Britannic Majesty's Procurator in Guernsey, speaking to the people of the United Kingdom, and in particular people who left Guernsey and Alderney during the evacuation. And he starts, the second thing he says is, "I imagine you must be greatly worried as to how we are getting on." He goes on to talk about, you probably think I'm reading a transcript thrust into my hand by a German officer at a point of a gun. Well, I'm not. He said the actual case was very different. And he basically just goes on to explain what's going on, that people can still worship, that the Germans are being courteous. That's probably part of the controversial bits, and talks about the fact that naturally the severance of communication with the UK is going to be a massive concern, and that it causes lots of problems. He goes on to explain that the controlling committee has been set up to speed up business. He goes on to say that the German troops' conduct has been exemplary, which, to be fair, at that point they were being well behaved, running a bit of a charm offensive, if anything. So at the time he recorded it, he says, we've been under occupation for 4.5 weeks. So if it went out on the 1st of August, it's pretty much been broadcast, within a day or two of him recording it. He talks about how he's proud of his fellow islanders, how they've been behaving. And then he goes on to emphasise that the islanders have always been intensely loyal subjects of His Majesty, and he wanted to make it clear to the Germans that was the case. That's still remained. Talked about Germans providing an officer who could speak excellent English, to enable them to work together in terms of trying to make sure everybody gets fed, etc. Then he specifically mentions the schools by name, and to the teachers and pupils send all their love and good wishes, and also refers to the military men and wishes them Godspeed. He then goes on to some personal messages and mentions his children, Mary Rose, John and Dick. Mummy and I send our fondest love and best wishes, and then references Stanford Raffles, who was one of the other people on the controlling committee. He says, tell Diana Raffles that her parents are well and send their love.
Okay, so this goes out on Radio Bremen. It's being monitored by the UK military and the UK government. Churchill was furious.
Absolutely furious.
It was seen as an unpatriotic gesture.
Yep.
And did the BBC actually carry it in the end?
No, it didn't.
They refused, didn't they?
No, it didn't. It received probably about 2 column inches in a couple of far-flung provincial newspapers. Not sure how they ended up publishing it. I've looked in the British Newspaper Archive. There's very little in there about it. It just refers to an alderman of Guernsey and making a speech, and that is it. The BBC didn't play it. Interestingly, because when they were recording his speech, the German officer that was doing it said, "Oh, we've got some spare time." So Ambrose Sherwell's wife was asked to record a message, which of course she'd had no time to prepare for. Hers was a little bit more controversial from the German perspective, and was never broadcast.
Okay, because it was really supposedly from Sherwell's wife to the mothers that had evacuated to reassure Guernsey women were okay, but and wanted news of evacuated children. But it was all in vain. So the Channel Island community that was now resident in the UK, having been evacuated, never heard it.
Yeah, unless anybody happened to be listening to Radio Bremen, which I'm not even sure about the technical feasibility.
Well, that would have been unpatriotic.
Of it. They would have really not known.
Okay, so we move from that, but also this is an aspect of island life was the fact that the press is to a large degree censored by the Germans. So this meant that rumours started to circulate. All kinds of rumours were circulating in the island. And we return again to Ambrose Sherwell, who tried to dispel a lot of the myths and reassure people, because these rumours were getting quite outlandish, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, and as I mentioned earlier, Douglas Ord is very sceptical about lots of things, mostly rumours that he hears from various parishioners, etc. But Ambrose Sherwell tried to dispel the rumours. In fact, so much so that he actually wrote a piece which appeared in the newspapers, basically saying that these rumours are untrue. And there were rumours that the Germans tried to get a cow on a plane to take it away from the island, but they couldn't get it. They couldn't get it on the plane, so instead they put a load of pigs on the plane instead and flown them away to France, and this was going to keep on happening and all this sort of stuff. And there's a very curious one, which I'm not quite sure how this would have happened. There was a rumour going around the Germans had commandeered 500,000 eggs, which that's an awful lot of eggs.
It is a lot of eggs.
When you're on an island that's
got about 19,000 people living on it.
Yeah, the 500,000 eggs seems rather a lot. But yeah, there were all sorts of... you can understand why it happened. There's speculation about what's going on. People didn't, they're spread out. The only way you can get around, broadly speaking, unless you've got a permit to use a car for a specific reason, or is to walk. So you're not going to unnecessarily travel to places. You can cycle. So these rumours start to spread, and they gain their own.
Yes,
life.
because we live in an age where we've got local radio, etc. Yep. But of course, the islanders did still have their wireless sets at this point, August 1940, but of course, this is going to be national news that they're listening to, and not local news. So the rumour mills are really going full time now. And you've touched upon food. Two of our diarists, Reverend Ord, and also Herbert Winterflood, have allude to food controls. So can you update us now? Second full month of the occupation. What's the food supplies?
Food supplies were already quite difficult because and being a small island, you can't grow everything that you need here. You can't make everything that you need here. So that was already causing problems. Not helped by, as we talked about in the July 1940 episode, the Germans were going around buying up everything they could possibly get their hands
with their Reichsmarks.
Indeed. Buying up everything that they could, even down to the German that we talked about, who was eating whole pats of butter. But so big problems. There were some restrictions introduced. Tin fruit, though, was available, which was. It was in the newspapers. It was flagged that there were issues with food, and you've got these new restrictions. But then trumpeted with tin fruit is available. They also had to declare what was in their larders. The Germans actually started searching houses.
So stock taking.
Yeah, basically, yeah. If they thought you had too much, then it was taken away. The other way with the restrictions on food, if you had some sort of medical condition, you could get basically a note from the doctor which said you needed additional rations or you needed specific foodstuffs, for example. Newspapers published tips on making your food go further. That was a recurrent theme. I'm
going to say we'll get into this as we go through the occupation. So some really bizarre things. And things that didn't work out too badly. But I suppose if you're desperate, you'll eat or smoke anything.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Keith. Yeah, in the newspaper, I looked at some of the newspapers from August 1940, and you've got adverts that are in the paper saying "Save our supplies: Guernsey electricity, water, bread, and coal." They were already looking at buses being converted to be driven by horses, but they didn't have the horses available to do that. You see people advertising foodstuffs that they've got, which must have been fairly risky to do, based on the fact the Germans were checking up on people. But really, they were advertising because they had something and wanted to swap with somebody else.
Barter system.
Kind of barter system. In very early stages of it, that developed much more sophisticated system later on. But one of the notices that did make me somewhat smile was that there's one placed by Stone Lakes, the pharmacy, and the headline on the advert says, "Cheer up. Troubles, worries, petty annoyances fade rapidly when you take Stone Lakes tonic elixir. It builds up the nervous system. One bottle will convince you." And it gives you the price there of 1 and 6. If it's stomach, liver, or digestions, you may rely on digestive tonic. It never fails. And Stone Lakes are still around.
They are. And at the time, and indeed now, we have Stone Lakes and Boots operating in our high street. One on the bridge, one of the villages over here, and they were in competition during the war. And in fact, my mother worked for the Stone Lake family about 50 years ago. And I was talking to a member of the family just the other week. So, and so, Nick, you got these fantastic adverts here about the buses being converted, and also Stone Lake's tonic elixir. Sounds like snake oil to me. And you'll put those adverts up on the Facebook page.
I'll put them on the Facebook page. If you don't like Facebook, when you're listening to this, if you're listening to this on one of the podcast platforms, you can scroll down to the show notes. I'll put them in there as well.
Okay. We're sort of already approaching the halfway point of the podcast. Just to round up on the food aspect here, we already have the controlling committee or the commodities committee. They've formed and they're already now going to try and source food from France.
Absolutely.
Can you just sort of run through how that got up and running and how it operates?
Sure. So Raymond Fallard was sent to France within a couple of weeks of.
Was he a civil servant or government, or was he a politician?
I believe he was a politician. So he
So he had the gravitas, and he had the
and he was sent to Granville to go and see what they could basically get from France, and he suffered some difficulties during that time because the Germans messed. He carried out that role for quite a while. And eventually we appointed an agent in Granville who was a Guernseyman who was sent over there to try and do that role on a sort of permanent basis. But he managed to secure lots of supplies of sugar, flour, butter, etc., things like that, particularly by the end of August 1940. Seeds for crops and things like that. So when they were wanting to do their crops in 1941, they'd actually have something to plant.
So he's paying the French vendors in Reichsmarks?
I presume so.
I think, but it was underwritten by Guernsey government.
Yeah, it was underwritten.
So it wasn't a case of saying to the Germans, "We'll go to France and they'll give us some food." Guernsey actually had to fund the purchase of this.
Yeah, absolutely. But the problems that he found were, the suppliers had no loyalty to the Channel Islands. I mean, why would they if they're not going to, but cut off their supplies to their own market? The other thing that was a massive problem for him was once he'd secured supplies of these things, the Germans would say, yes, you can put them on this ship going to Guernsey, and then they'd change their mind at a moment's notice. In fact, he got so annoyed with the Germans that he threatened to quit at one point. I suspect it was probably more than one point that he threatened to quit.
Yeah, I love that you supply me with some notes, and it's this wonderful sort of job description. If you'd like to just read that out.
This did amuse me slightly. So they'd originally decided that they needed somebody to do this. They did actually place an advert which said, "Must speak French, put up with disappointments and keep their temper." which is how they ended up appointing George Vaudin later on as the permanent agent in Granville. He actually escaped from Granville as after D-Day. He found his way to Allied lines
So he'll crop up again.
He'll crop up again
from time to time
when we get to 1944.
Well,
We'll probably speak about him before then.
Yeah. Okay, and so again, just pressing on with social affairs and entertainment, etc., and also requisition of property. Now that people, I return to this here, people evacuated, it left houses empty. Now my grandmother had gone to live with my great aunt, and so we had a collection of lots of different members of the family in a very, very small cottage in the Valumphry area of St Martin's, and we will return to that later on in a series of podcasts. But grandmother had gone to a German depot, which is in a cluster of states houses, which people in the UK would know as council houses, and grandmother had picked up a package of potato peel, presumably to make a pie with, and she saw some empty houses, and she managed to get in touch with the authorities and began renting one of the houses. It's in the Route de Couture for local listeners, and in fact I lived in that house myself in the 50s, but there was a requisition of property left in terms of evacuated, so it was requisitioned by the civilian authorities,
Yep.
but with the heft and the of the German authorities behind it.
Well, I suppose there were a couple of aspects. There were the fact that the Germans needed to billet troops somewhere. They needed to put their troops somewhere. They weren't so picky. They just basically could turn up at your house and say, "Get out! We're taking this over," which caused massive problems for some people. I read an account yesterday of a gentleman who they basically turned up at his house and said he had 2 hours to pack everything up and go. Which you can imagine, how do you then find somewhere to live? So there was that aspect of it, and that some people were displaced 3 or 4 times during the occupation. The other aspect was the requisition of property left in the houses, but also finding houses. The civilian government also found houses quite often because the Germans had kicked somebody out. The Germans always wanted the most modern and most impressive looking houses, unsurprisingly, as being the occupying force. So the civilian government had to help these people to find somewhere to live, which is what they did. But also the civilian government, being quite practical about it, realised that some of these houses may have food stocks in them, other useful things. So just apart from the food, things like soap, medicines, cleaning materials, and things like that that just couldn't get their hands on. And the best thing to do with those was to collect them all up and then use those as stocks for the island. Where there were personal items, if a house had been abandoned, the civilian authorities would the advice to the people that were looking at these properties was to lock personal items in, things of value in cupboards. Radios being one of them, actually, specifically mentioned, was the best advice for anybody from the local government that was inspecting a house, thinking about the fact that it might be used for something, was to lock valuables in a cupboard where possible.
Okay. Well, moving on to now, one of the things that did surprise people is the cinemas opened or reopened, and they were showing German films and film stock. Hollywood films were being shown.
Yeah, it's a bit of an so the Germans pretty much immediately started showing some of their films. So one that was shown in August 1940 is called The Final Chord. It was a 1936 film about a young, impoverished German woman named Hannah, and she gives up her child for adoption, emigrates to America to live with her husband, who then kills himself, and she returns to Germany and works as a maid. And it sounds like a thoroughly depressing film. And having looked it up, I believe that my assessment of it sounds like a depressing film is it really was a depressing film.
To take a bottle of the elixir with you.
Yeah, it was basically it was more or less a propaganda film to say life's better for you in Germany, regardless of whatever. Now, Herbert Winterflood, in his book, actually said, well, I'm starting to wonder where some of these films are coming from in terms of the Hollywood films and things like that. Now, obviously, when the Germans arrived, there were maybe 1 or 2 films at each cinema that were, here that hadn't been shown yet, which could then be shown. But he was wondering where these other ones were turning up. And he surmises that there must have been a bit of a swap with some of the cinemas in Jersey, because the Regal got a screening of Mannequin with Gene Crawford and Spencer Tracy, and the week after, The Wizard of Oz was hitting the screens.
So quite bizarre to think of that.
Yeah,
being occupied and watching The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, and at the Gaumont, another cinema, they had Over the Moon, which was set in Yorkshire and featured probably the most famous person in it. When I had a look at it, was Rex Harrison.
Yeah, Rex Harrison, who turned up in Dr. Dolittle, I think, many, many years later. Okay, so at this point, what we're going to do is we have a new theme tune written by Jim Delbridge from the album The Navigator. We're going to play that track in full now in this first episode that we include it in. And it's called 5 to 7. Of course, this was the point where the Germans raided Guernsey, an air raid on the 28th of June 1940, on or around 5 to 7. There's a wonderful video that I helped produce a little while ago, shot by Dennis Le Prévost, with Jim singing to camera. You can find that by Googling, I think, Nick,
it's
5
on
to 7.
Yeah,
but you're going to post a link.
It's on YouTube, but I'll stick a link in the show notes and also on the Facebook page.
Yeah, so we're going to play this in full. It's called 5 to 7, as I said. It's by Jim Delbridge, and I think it's a marvellous track. So here we go.
To the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew what was to come. But someone had to stay to carry on. Austin's ports and Morris's abandoned on the quay, and the children crossed the sea and became evacuees. Locked up shops and houses with no one left inside, as everybody tried to get away. It's 5 to 7. Winston went and left us on our own. Classified, demilitarized zone. But nobody told Hitler on the phone. He might have left us all alone. Tomato trucks and propaganda, the story would be told. How the Jerry's blew big holes in our poor defenseless souls. But all our homeless children went to splendid northern towns, where they shared them all around, in the hills or on the downs. And everybody had to stay away. It's 5 to 7. It's 7. The lorries burned as the hindcools disappeared. 33 dead as the smoke began to clear. A nightmare that would last the next 5 years. And it was worse than we had feared. And for an opening salvo, they paint the white rock red. mighty fathers who were signing up to fight. Yeah, they won't forget to rise, and they won't forget that night. But everybody had to stay away. It's 5 to 7. It's 5 to 7. It's 5 to 7.
Well, what a marvellous track. Absolutely superb. And thanks, Nick, for securing that. And thanks, Jim. I'm sure you're listening. Thanks for letting us have that. Now, military matters, Nick.
Indeed. Well, we'll get on to military matters. What's been going on from a military perspective? Well, if you were listening to our July episode, the last one, then you'll know all about the commando raids and various things going on, and there were two chaps who were still stuck here, two Guernseymen, who hadn't been able to make contact to get on a submarine or a boat to get off the island. So on the 3rd of August, Sergeant Stanley Fairbrush was sent to Guernsey, and he arrived in Gnet Bay, just like everybody else.
Not everybody else. It was getting a pretty busy place. Our only nudist beach as well.
You'd have thought they might have actually been a bit more careful about landing there again for what was the 3rd or 4th time.
Well, we've got to speak about Parker yet, but
so he arrived there, very quickly discovered that they had actually surrendered. So not wanting to waste his time here, he gathered some information that was going to be useful to the military, and he was going to be picked up on the 5th. But this also is a recurring theme with our waters around here being a little bit difficult at times. And also they had problems with boats and things like that in terms of the boats they used. He finally got picked up on the 6th. He only had to wait one night, unlike some of the others. So yeah, he successfully got back with information.
Okay, so that's Fairbrush, who's really checking up on Desmond Mulholland and Phil Martell, who listeners should know that certainly these were very, very young, brave men. I mean, Mulholland was only 21. Philip Martell, I think, was probably around about the same age. And I think their story, Nick, especially with Peter Jesson's book, No News from Guernsey, we should look at perhaps doing a special on those two chaps.
I've certainly got plenty of information about them. There's an article on my blog, which you can find on Iron Fortress, about those two gentlemen. Their families actually suffered from despite the fact they'd actually surrendered themselves. Mulholland's mother and Martel's sister were sent to France by the Germans. It was a bit of a bizarre one, though, because they sent them to France, 15 kilometres from the coast, and they had to report to the Germans daily, but they weren't actually in prison or anything like that.
No, and not only that, but Mulholland's mother was a lady called Dorothy Morehouse, and her husband was a gentleman called Arthur Michael, A.C. Michael, who was a painter who went on to paint Sherwood after the war. Dorothy's husband, Arthur, actually asked the Germans if he could go to France and enter captivity with his wife, and they said yes. So he went off. Yes, they went off together, and Dorothy returned home.
January 1941.
Exactly, after Christmas, and of course, as a punishment to the rest of the population, the wireless sets were removed. I don't know if that was actually during August.
They were removed. That was in September, and they were then given back on Christmas Eve.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
But we'll get to that later on.
Sorry, Nick.
So yeah, the Germans basically deported them, and announced that it was to stop further attempts by the Allies or by actually the locals from helping anybody that came and landed from British forces.
So the people that were, as a result of Mulholland and Martell handing themselves in, they were deported. Was there, did somebody commit suicide? was that
that's
something
later on.
that's
Yeah.
later on when Nicol and Symes come on? We'll get that.
We'll get to that. That's later on in 1940.
Okay, so Furbrush has come. He's gone back again. Mulholland and Martel are in captivity, POWs, and of course they did come in civilian clothing. Uniforms were procured for them, and there was a sort of will they or will they not be shot?
Yes,
and we know that they weren't, but it came pretty bloody close, didn't it?
It did come close, yeah. The German officer that said basically they wouldn't be shot, they weren't being treated as spies, and went away on leave, came back and was absolutely furious because he found they were being treated as spies, and because he was old school Prussian officer from military from a long career, he was furious that they'd broken his word, and he managed to get that changed because they would have been shot undoubtedly.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Otherwise.
Okay, now the other thing that happened on the 9th of August 1940 is that there was quite a raid, air raid. The Allies mounted an air raid predominantly on Guernsey's airport. Could you sort of just talk us through that?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting one actually. It's actually 3 air raids that happened in the end. So and it's got an interesting connection to Guernsey from somebody who was involved in it. So the first person to bomb the island airport on the 9th of August was Pilot Officer Gerard Glaister, DFC. Now he was on a raid bombing the French coast, couldn't see his target, came back this way, spotted that there were lots of aircraft on the airfield and decided to bomb it. He's an interesting character because he went on to produce Colditz, Secret Army, and Howard's Way. And of course, if you're old enough to remember Howard's Way, one of the episodes was actually filmed in Guernsey.
I was old enough to avoid watching it.
But anyway, so
Yep.
he raided in his Blenheim, dropped some bombs on the airport. Then another raid came back with 5 aircraft after he'd reported seeing.
As a result, or just coincidentally?
Yeah, as a result.
Yeah.
Because he'd reported that there were these aircraft here. So there were 40 to 50 German aircraft counted on the ground, and little damage was done. Hangar hit, 1 transport aircraft. A petrol store and barracks were damaged by fire. And next day, all the aircraft were gone. It's reported in all of the British papers that basically by the next day, the Germans had all moved all their aircraft back to France, which they did temporarily.
But there were fatalities, weren't there? There were. It's reported that there were 5 German military personnel killed at the airport because didn't a Messerschmitt 109 spin off the runway into a gun pit?
Yeah, there was. I can't remember if that was on the 9th.
It was, and the reason I know that is the 9th of August happens to be my birthday. But I'm also researching the possibility that the 5 Germans that died on that day weren't all at the airport. I think that there was a supplementary raid that day, but that's something I'm researching, which I know you and I have discussed it. So that raid actually did result in German fatalities.
Yeah, it did. It did, and there were other consequences of it as well. I mean, one of the things that made me laugh when I was reading an official account of this was it said it was the third of the raids was accurate bombing from high altitude. Now, if you know anything about bombing during World War II, there was no such thing as accurate bombing from high altitude. Of course, they were going to say that that was actually put out in newspaper articles as well. It's just not possible. No. If you've read anything around that area, you'd know.
So what sort of altitude would a Blenheim sort of come in, and not so much perhaps the first one with Gerard Glaister, but if Blenheims were sent here to drop bombs on the airport, what sort of altitude are we talking about?
I'm not sure what altitude they came in at, because if you look at the ones from later on in the war, they came in pretty low low and fast, which is the sensible thing to do because there were an awful lot of flak. So I'm not sure. It was the third raid that was noted as being high altitude. I can't actually find anything.
Well, maybe
much on,
I'm sure
on
we've
that
got some
area.
Blenheim fans out there that they can
yeah.
always get in touch.
Yeah, I would imagine when they say high altitude, they're probably talking 10,000, 15,000
exactly.
feet.
That's what I
At
think.
that stage in the war, I can't imagine. But you imagine trying to hit something that's 9x5. I mean, they were lucky to get bombs within miles of their targets, bombing mainland Europe. So I think that's pretty unlikely. But there was one other thing that I came across. It's in the September Controlling Committee minutes, but it relates to the raid. And there was a 30-pound bomb which fell in the roadway at the Marche in the forest and failed to explode. And the Germans didn't take any action about removing it. And it was inspected by the police and reported to the fire brigade. And one of the firemen actually volunteered to remove that bomb. And it's recorded that they considered this a very courageous act and worthy of commendation. I just think that's an incredible thing to do if you're not bomb disposal expert or anything like that.
And again, Nick, you've provided in our notes an account of that, so that will go up on listeners will be able to view that on the Facebook page.
I'm not sure I can share that.
Right, okay.
I don't think my source will.
Oh, okay.
Allow that one,
so,
unfortunately.
My bad, as they now say. But I'm sure, Nick, if you can share it,
Yeah, I'll
you
check.
will.
I'll
yeah.
check.
Okay. We're in the last 5 minutes or so of today's episode, but I want to, Nick, for you to just explain here that the Channel Islands are now being referred to in the German media. This is the German media back home in Germany. Could you explain a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, there was. I'm probably going to murder the pronunciation of this because I don't speak German. I think it's pronounced Die Wehrmacht, which is a bit like our picture post that they had in the 1940s. And Reverend Ord talks about seeing Guernsey mentioned with a representation of Goring on the front cover, and it talks about the Channel Islands. And Ord could actually speak German, so he was asked by somebody to translate it, which he did. And the gist of it was the long arm of the German army has reached out and taken the Channel Islands, never before invaded in 900 years. The islands were England's pistol at the head of the Western European continent. And it goes on, but it was all along those lines. And interestingly, in capital letters, it had, when you get to the end of it, it is in German hands and will so remain.
Yes, so because we should remind people, of course, that August 1940, the Battle of Britain was still raging.
Yep.
And the threat of invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was still expected to take place. So a lot going on. And for this to be placed in the German media, there was still an expectation in Germany that Britain would be successfully
invaded. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so just we've got a couple of minutes left. I mean, at the same time, as we said, we have touched on Battle of Britain is still raging. The British forces are pretty much, on the back foot in terms of the war and generally. But the RAF bombed Berlin for the first time. In August 1940. Became a loss of face for Hermann Goering, who boasted that Berlin would never be bombed, and then Hitler authorised the bombing of London as a result. So that was the start of the Blitz, pretty
basically.
much. And it just says, I've got my note, your note, in fact, Nick, the first RAF raid on Berlin took place on the night of the 25th of August 1940. 95 aircraft were dispatched to bomb Tempelhof Airport. Now, of course, this is almost a full year since the war had actually been declared.
Yeah.
Okay, well, in the last few seconds, though, what we're going to do, Nick, can you give a quick plug for Island Fortress, your blog?
Island Fortress, if you Google it, it comes up fairly high up the pages, so you can find all sorts of interesting articles and things on there if you want to take a look at some of the things that we've talked about in more detail. Okay, and this podcast programme comes to you from Gnet Radio. Please search for Gnet Radio. Gnet Radio funded
and supported by Guernsey Arts. We're going to have a little bit more of 5 to 7. Nick and I will be with you in 2 weeks' time.
Talking about September.
September
Plenty
19th.
of things to talk about, not least some more commando raids.
Yep. Okay, good night from Nick and I, and also from producer Sean, who's sitting in. Good night.
Cheers.
It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.